Okay, hi everyone. Let's start. I'm Arthur Grimes. I'm a senior fellow at Motu Research. We're hosting this public policy seminar, as you can see. Thank you all for attending, and I wish to thank Russell McVeigh for the fabulous premises as well. It's a great place to run a seminar from. Motu public policy seminars are something we hold approximately every month, and they're funded by ECA and Stats NZ and Treasury. So thanks very much to those three supporters for enabling us to make these occur. We're going to have a really fascinating webinar today with one presenter and three commentators on it, and I'll chair the panel session. We have people on a webinar at the moment, and I just want to make sure if people on the webinar, can you just give a thumbs up or whatever so that you can hear and see? That's fantastic. Okay, good to know. That's always it. And if you're on the webinar and you wish to have a question put to the panel, please use the Q&A function rather than the chat function, and Emma here from Motu will be monitoring the Q&A. And when we come to the question time, we'll alternate between questions from the floor and questions from Zoom link. Okay, well, it's a great pleasure for me to be able to introduce the main speaker today, as well as our three panellists. The main speaker today, topic is putting children at the centre, using our knowledge of child development to give Kiwi kids the best start to life. Main speaker is Jaimie Monk. Jaimie is a fellow at Motu. She focuses on work to do, quantitative work to do with family well-being, housing, child poverty, and also technology use by children, screen use, etc. The work she'll be talking about is really a sort of postdoc type work, but I also had the great pleasure of supervising Jaimie's PhD as well, along with Phil Morrison's. So it's always nice. People say to me, what's it like with a PhD student? I say the main thing in supervising a PhD is to get the right student. To choose the right student, you're fine, and then it's all easy. And it was, of course, with Jaimie, who did a fabulous PhD. So Jaimie will talk for about 30 minutes on the topic, and then we have three commentators. The first will be Hannah Kerr, who's Director of the Child Wellbeing and Poverty Reduction Group at MSD in Wellington. She's got 20 years in public policy experience in New Zealand and the UK, spanning disability, health, education, environment and justice. So Hannah will be our first panellist. Our second panellist will be Jacqui Southey, who's from Save the Children, New Zealand. She's driving systemic change for children to realise their rights in Aotearoa, and she's an author of significant research on discipline practices of parents, positive disciplinary practices of parents for young children, and has worked on children's rights. And our third speaker is Dr. Jim Russell, who's a development paediatrician at Starship Child Health, and now also a clinical chief advisor for child and youth health at the Ministry of Health. She's a regular contributor on these topics. Her PhD investigated developmental health trajectories and socioeconomic predictors using the Growing Up in New Zealand study, which is also the study that Jaimie uses. So, without further ado, Jaimie, I'll throw it over to you. Thanks.
Apparently I'm using this to change slides, so hopefully I might just put that there. Yeah, it works, even better. Well, kia ora koutou. Thank you, Arthur. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. It's always a delight when you do research and you invest a lot of time in it that people actually want to know what you found. And so I think it's really useful, helpful research. And so I'm glad you're here to join me as we start this discussion, I guess, or continue it on. And thank you to the panelists as well. I really appreciate your expertise. I'm really looking forward to hearing what you have to say as we go on. Also welcome everybody who's online from around the Motu. There's a couple from Australia as well. It's great to have you all here too. About me, as way of introduction, yes, I've been a fellow at Motu for a couple of years now, but my academic background is economics and public policy, and I'm really interested in family wellbeing and child poverty in New Zealand and a lot of the sort of structural factors that determine the differences in advantage and disadvantage that we have for New Zealand children. So that's what I've focused in on. Also relevant in this discussion, I am a parent too, so I've got 3 kids who are 10, nearly 12 and 14. So I've got the fun of learning how to parent a teenager at the moment. So any tips are more than welcome. Cool. So this work that we're going to be sharing about today kind of stemmed from this knowledge that there's a real importance for children's social and emotional development for their long-term outcomes. And we've, hearing more reports of kids arriving at school that aren't prepared for learning and not able to pay attention or to be able to engage with their peers, engage with their schoolwork. And this has important problems long-term and can sort of entrench some disadvantages and things. So that was what got me started on this track. And I'm really keen for us to sort of have some New Zealand relevant research on the importance of the early years. This discussion's happening internationally a lot, but we don't have the depth of data in New Zealand because we're so small. So I wanted to be able to contribute to that as well. So I should also say this hasn't been done alone. I've had some wonderful help on this project. So Arthur's been involved. Phil, your work has been helpful too. And we've got I saw Christy Carter came join in online as well. Jacqui, you've been involved from the beginning as a sounding board of ideas. That's been great. And Hannah, you and your team at various stages along the way have been also super helpful. And Dr. Kate Frickett as well has been a very important part of this project. So awkwardly change slides from here. What we're going to be going through briefly, I have introduction. I'm going to focus in on income and child behaviour findings that I've got, but we're also going to talk briefly about children's technology use and some on stress and housing, and then also we'll talk conclusions and policy implications before the panel. All right, I'll stand over here so you can hear properly. You see? Okay. So this is the research questions that we were interested in. Firstly, does adequate household income help protect children from developing behaviour problems? So it's a relationship between income and child behaviour. And then further, what roles do maternal stress and children's screen use play in this relationship? So this is at a very, very broad level. We're talking household income here. Child screen use is the number of hours that children are spending in front of screens. And our stress measure covers a whole bunch of different things that parents could find stressful and how stressful they find them. So it's quite a broad measure of stress. And child behaviour is the outcome. So this has been developed from the Strengths and Difficulties questionnaire, which captures children's social and emotional development. So as we go on, I'll be talking about difficulties, and particularly child difficulties. This covers these 4 kind of key areas. So have these in mind as we go. Those are conduct problems, hyperactivity, peer relationship problems, and emotional problems. Also part of this measure is a strengths score, which is to do with children's pro-social behaviour. I haven't focused deeply on that, but I'll give you a little snippet as we go. Data I've used, as Arthur said, is Growing Up in New Zealand, which I really hope you're all familiar with because it is the most amazing study and it has so many incredible variables and a real depth to it in terms of understanding New Zealand families. So there's nearly 7,000 children that have been followed from pregnancy right the way through, and these kids are about 14, 15 years old now. At the beginning, definitely, it's broadly generalisable to the New Zealand population, so we have a really diverse group of families in this study. And the research I'm sharing today, we're focusing on from pregnancy through to 8 years of age, which was the data available at the time of the study. And we use data that's mother reported and about the child as well. There is father data in Growing Up in New Zealand, but We didn't want to focus the study only on two-parent families with an engaged father, which was what was going to happen if we used that data. So we're just looking at mothers, which is not to say that fathers aren't important. I have brought my husband here on Bring Your Husband to Work Day. Can attest fathers are very important, but due to data constraints, that's what we focused on for this. Okay. So very quickly, I'm going to give you a quick stats lesson, which is also helpful if anyone's dealing with quantitative data. But there's two main approaches that we can use when we're looking at longitudinal data like growing up in New Zealand. So the first is looking at the difference between groups. And this often happens when we're using sort of one aspect of one wave of data, one time point. We'll look at, say, children from high-income families and children from low-income families, and then we can compare the differences in the outcomes between those groups. This is helpful and useful information, but it might not tell us that much about income because there's a lot of reasons why those two groups are different. Could be to do with education, the parents' upbringing themselves, these sorts of differences. And so what growing up in New Zealand and data like this is really helpful for is that we can actually look at the differences within children or within families over time. So we can compare periods where income is high with periods where income is low. And so this is not fully causal data, but it gets us a lot further down the journey in terms of trying to understand what's actually happening. So all the stats and tables and equations and everything's in the report. So you're welcome to look that up if you're interested, but I wanted to keep this high level as we've gone. All right, so this is going to be going back and forwards here. This is a bit awkward. Pardon? Apparently it doesn't, but it does. Oh, it's a miracle. There we go. Great. Okay. So starting here with the main results we've got, talking about income and child behaviour, and this is for 2-year-olds to 8-year-olds. Okay. Wanted to start with this graph, which shows the distribution of child difficulty scores across income groups. So I've just grouped it as low, medium, high to keep it simple for a slide. But we can see here a very clear pattern. This dashed line here are children from low income families, a higher average difficulty score, which is the vertical line, and through the light blue one is the high income families. And when I graph this with all 7 income groups, there's this perfect lining up of difficulty scores. And so it's a very clear income gradient to child behaviour at 2 years of age. I also want to show it because I think distributions are important. A lot of the following work focuses on the mean effects, but actually it doesn't, there's still a large number of children from the low income group with no behaviour problems. And there's still a number of children in the high income group that do. So I want you to keep that in mind as we're looking at the results as we go. This here is, I'm going to talk about the strength score once, but I think it's important to highlight. So this is showing the distribution of strengths or pro-social behaviour by income group for 2-year-olds. We can see that there's no difference here. I was expecting to see the opposite. But as you go over time at older ages, we see exactly the same pattern. And I think this probably suggests that parents in the low income groups are actually doing a really good job of teaching their children pro-social skills, things like helping others or concern for someone if they're hurt. These sorts of things are happening, but maybe more of the difficulties, problem behaviour stuff is more structurally caused. That would be my reading. But I'm happy to hear other theories if anyone's got them. Got my confidence intervals. This happened last time I presented too. Sorry. Well, anyway, this is the central. The next 2 slides, if you want to engage with anything, these are the 2 most important ones. This is showing us the relationship between income and child difficulty scores within a family. So we're looking at differences within families, and I've included an interaction term here for the way of which I collect the data. But overall, what this is showing us is that during the preschool years, which are the 2 grey lines that slope downwards, in periods where income's higher, children's behaviour problems are lower. Okay, and that's probably the central thing I want you to take away from this. Not the case at 8 years of age. 8 years of age, we have a flat line. Okay, so this is pointing us towards the early years being important again. Effect sizes are not great, not huge here. If you know standard deviations, we've standardized these measures. However, we have used income bands. And so there's 7 income bands. To have had an increase in income to reach the next band, it has to be a pretty big step up. So we're fairly confident that we have underestimated effect sizes here. But we are picking up this relationship. All right, this is a lot of complex stats I've tried to map onto a graph. So I'll explain this slowly as we go through. What I wanted to understand was why we were getting these previous results, because that's really what's important. What's happening within families. And I've used something called a Galbach decomposition, which basically means we look at this relationship between income and difficulties. In a regression equation, we add in a whole lot of other variables and we see what happens to income. So we're trying to understand what's explaining the statistical relationship between these two variables here. So I think I'll start here with what's not associated with difficulties. So once we've put everything in the models, what we find at 2 years of age, things that often are, neighbourhood deprivation, partner status, housing tenure, residential mobility, P&D, mother's health, mother's personal support, which is kind of interesting in and of itself. We have down here a box of things that are associated with difficulty scores, but nothing to do with income. So a child's sex at birth, the number of siblings in the household, and how often they're waking up in the night. Here I've separated out some things that I think are associated with both to keep them off to the side. But this is the box that's most interesting. And this is what I really want to show you is happening. These are the things that are explaining this statistical relationship over and above income itself. Top of the list, we have hostile parenting and maternal stress. These two factors are very related. Once you dive into them, there's actually an interaction effect happening there. But hostile parenting is parenting behaviours that are things like shouting at children, yelling at them, belittling them, lots of the things we know aren't great for kids. And that variable came out strong across nearly everything I did. Next, we have reading and screen use, which work in opposite directions. So reading, engaged parenting, screen use, probably less engaged parenting. Child health, positive parenting, and protective parenting. What this paints us is a clear picture of, these are pretty much all, aside from health, related to the mother-child, parent-child interaction. That seems to be this telling us that for these low-income families, it seems the income, if we look at the other graph, is related to a lower quality of parent-child interactions, and that this has a flow-on effect to behaviour problems later on. What's also interesting, I've did this at 2 years, 4.5, and 8 years of age. 4.5 years looks almost identical, so I won't show you that. But at 8 years, it looks quite different. This box here in the middle is different. We no longer got this focus on the parent-child interactions, but we've got children's health, residential mobility, waking in the night, health, mobility, housing starts to become part of the picture here. And so at 8 years of age, firstly, there's not such a strong relationship with income, and what we do have is related to more external factors than the parent-child relationship. Okay, right. Wanted to know what role technology played. It pops up a little bit as we've gone so far. But this is again 2-year-olds to 8-year-olds. I want to start this by anchoring this in the wider literature on children's screen use and behaviour problems, because people have strong opinions on this and feel like it's very settled that screen use is bad. That's actually not what the literature tells us, particularly in relation to time, screen time, which is the measure we're looking at here. There's a lot of, screen use can be considered in a lot of different ways. It can be both positive and negative. And so I want to say that before I start, because we did actually find a relationship between higher levels of screen use and child behaviour problems, but only for preschoolers. So again, this is looking at within families. So we see that during the preschool years, when screen use is lower, behaviour problems are lower when comparing with the same child over time. I will say that there's also other things happening within a family that we need to put screen use in its bigger picture. And I think I've done other work that shows a relationship between stress and screen use for preschoolers. So it could be that stressful times are happening in a family and kids are getting more screen use because of that. And all of that together has an association with behaviour problems. All right, stress and housing. I wanted to talk a little bit because part of the policy partnership I had, I guess, as we developed this research from the beginning, wanted to do a deep dive into stress, maternal stress and maternal wellbeing in the first 1,000 days. So we've done a piece of work looking at pregnancy through to 2 years of age on maternal stress. And also housing, because the longer I'm in this game and looking at New Zealand and poverty and families, housing just is so central to nearly everything I look at. And so I wanted to highlight that as well. This here shows us the relationship between income and maternal stress at different periods of time. Again, I've put these interaction effects in. So it's probably not a surprise to anyone that periods where income is higher, mothers are less stressed. The relationship's stronger, pregnancy at 2 years, not at 9 months of age. And that's because at 9 months, actually, stress was a lot lower across the board, which was interesting. Not entirely sure why. Being pregnant is stressful, maybe having a 2-year-old is stressful and 9 months we're in a little bubble, I'm not sure, but that's what we found with these results. And so again, I wanted to know why, because that's very important. And so I've done the same process here to try and understand the relationship between income and stress. I've just pulled up the one for 2 years of age. These are associations here again, remembering. We can see here at the top the things that are explaining the association between income and stress for mothers. With 2-year-olds is to do with housing tenure and residential mobility. And again, these things are all related to housing. And so, yeah, health is related to housing, but also access to healthcare. There's a big picture going on here as well. I've actually just about to finish a piece of work. I see Philippa has just walked in before, but to do with housing, looking at this data. And so if you follow the Motu account, I'll update you with that once that's out too. All right, so I thought I had lots of words and I thought, no, I think just a flow chart is probably what we need here to explain what's been happening. This, again, is not causal. This is me taking all the stats and results and everything that I've found and trying to paint a useful policy picture as to what this evidence seems to be saying. So it seems to be saying at 8 years of age, there is a small relationship between income and behaviour, but it's not that strong. Preschool years, it's important. And in these preschool years, a higher income means less stress on families and more engaged parenting, and a relationship, so less stressed parenting, and that seems to be benefiting child outcomes. In terms of policy and where we try and change this, I mean, there's options right the way through. Obviously, increasing incomes is one of those. It's a very straightforward policy lever in terms of it's not hard to do. It is also expensive and requires political will. That's not my topic of expertise right now. I think stress is a very important part of this process in terms of how we provide social services to parents. I think they need to be adequate and they need to be easy to access, but they also need to be predictable. There's no point in having a warm, dry, affordable home if you're spending your time stressed that next week you're going to get kicked out of it. Predictability is super important for parents and parenting. Got parent and more engaged parenting, obviously the options of parenting courses, teaching families how to handle the stress, how to budget, all these sorts of things as well, obviously will potentially help in this process too. But I'm really looking forward to hearing from the panelists and hearing what they have to say as well on all of this. So overall, I think this evidence says to me that we need to be taking a developmental perspective to how we engage with children in terms of how we help families. Children's needs are very different across the life course. Needs of teenagers are very different to that of preschoolers. And so thinking hard about what we know about child development and what's important at each stage is just key in this. Couple of extra points. Health and housing support, really important for expectant and new mothers' wellbeing. And we should be considering screen use in the wider family context, not getting up in arms. And I have concerns at the moment about a fear-based narrative around children's technology use. And I think we need to put that to the side and look at things in a holistic, big picture perspective. Oh, hopefully that wasn't too much of a whirlwind. We'll do questions overall for all of us at the end. However, if you do want to email me anything, here's my email address. I'm also super happy if any of your teams are interested in this evidence to pop in and share with you and ask and answer questions about it. The point of this is for it to be useful. And so I would really, really like to be able to share it with anyone who thinks it would be useful for their team. So perfect, I'll hand back to you, Arthur, and then
Thanks very much, Jaimie. The work is always fascinating, so it's great to hear it. Thanks very much. Right, we've got 3 panelists to start with, and I'm just straight away. Hannah Kerr, Director of Child Wellbeing and Poverty Reduction Group at MSD. Hannah, over to you.
Kia ora koutou, ko Hannah Kerr tōku ingoa. I'm Hannah, I'm the Director of the Child Wellbeing and Poverty Reduction Group at the Ministry of Social Development. And my team was one of the policy partners for Jaimie's work. And so I just wanted to talk briefly about a couple of things. First of all, a little bit about the Child and Youth Strategy. And one of the roles that my team plays is that we are the stewards for the Child and Youth Strategy on behalf of the Minister for Child Poverty Reduction. And you may or may not know that we developed a new strategy last year following the 2023 election. And it was fantastic to have Jaimie's research, to have research grounded in a New Zealand context to inform that work. So I just wanted to talk about a couple of the touch points. And then when Jaimie was preparing us all for today, she suggested it might also be interesting to touch on what we see from where we each sit in the system around some of the challenges, I'm going to say challenges rather than barriers, to child-centred policy design. So my team kind of sits at a cross-government system level. So I've got a couple of observations on that to share as well. So starting with the Child and Youth Strategy, which is a legislative requirement, and it's the government's framework for setting out the outcomes, the wellbeing outcomes it wants to achieve for children and young people. The outcomes themselves are enduring. We have the same outcomes as the previous government set in 2019, but as part of the refresh of the strategy last year, we have a new set of policy priorities. So before we started the work to refresh the strategy, Minister Upston gave us some direction, and she really wanted the strategy to focus on areas that required cross-government collaboration, and also to really focus on prevention and early intervention to complement the government targets. So if we think about the 9 government targets, they are mostly responding to issues that have developed. They are about getting kids back into school, addressing child and youth offending, moving people off a job seeker benefit, for example. And what she was really interested in with the strategy is thinking about what are the upstream things that government needs to be doing from a prevention and early intervention lens to get ahead of these issues. So we did targeted engagement, including with academics. We looked very carefully at the evidence, and as I say, Jaimie's research was really valuable in that context because a lot of the evidence is international. So having New Zealand-based evidence, it always has greater weight. And in October last year, Cabinet agreed to 3 policy priorities. So supporting children, families and whānau in the first 2,000 days, reducing child material hardship, and preventing child harm. So there are some really obvious touch points, particularly with those first two priorities. So supporting children, families and whānau in the first 2,000 days and reducing material hardship, which is this government's focus when they are talking about child poverty reduction. And within each of the priority areas, there are some more specific areas of focus. So if we take the first 2,000 days as an example, the three focus areas within that are supporting positive parenting, supporting maternal mental health, and supporting cognitive and behavioural development. And what we can really see very clearly from Jaimie's research is that those three are not distinct, they all overlap, they reinforce each other. And then there are touch points across the other priorities as well, housing in relation to reducing material hardship, for example. So just to focus on the first 2,000 days briefly, the ecological model is particularly important across the strategy, but in those first 2,000 days, thinking about children in the context of their family and whānau, we know that parental factors play a greater role in the first 2,000 days, as Jaimie's just talked about. So positive parenting, maternal mental health, reducing maternal stress are all really important levers. And so in identifying those things as focus areas, ministers have agreed that those are areas where agencies and ministers need to collaborate, and they are areas for additional prioritisation and investment, or perhaps in the current context, reprioritisation of funding. So you may have seen in the pre-budget social investment announcement, there was some new funding announced to support positive parenting, for example. Which is a sort of first small step to implementing the strategy, and there is a whole lot of work happening across agencies in areas like maternal mental health, also in support of those focus areas. So we've seen really huge benefits to being a policy partner on this piece of work. It's really helped us ensure that the strategy is identifying the right things. Of course, words on a page, I'm just anticipating what some of the questions might be. You know, the implementation is going to be absolutely key, and I'll perhaps touch on that a little bit in a couple of minutes. So the other part of what I wanted to talk about is what are some of those challenges that we see from where we sit in the system around child-centred policy design. And so again, I'm just going to use the first 2,000 days as an example, because I think it's quite a good illustration of the two things that I wanted to talk about. So we know that investment in the first 2,000 days leads to benefits that accrue across multiple outcome areas and across the life course. So we expect that investing in the first 2,000 days, of course, will have immediate benefits, but that will then have flow-on effects into education, ultimately into welfare, into justice in corrections outcomes, both of which are really key reasons why investment in the first 2,000 days is so important, but both of which also come with challenges in that government context. So where benefits accrue across multiple outcome areas, and therefore multiple agencies have an interest, sometimes there can be a challenge in identifying and agreeing where the investment should come from. So in the first 2,000 days, health is the universal sector. Health is the system with which most families, I mean, ideally all families, are engaging in those first 2,000 days. But the benefits of that engagement accrue across education, welfare, justice, corrections. And so the responsibility that health bears, they have a legitimate position that should be shared across other agencies. And then, of course, benefits accrue over the long term, and there can sometimes be a tension there when governments are looking to invest for immediate outcomes. So we know that there are immediate outcomes from investing in the first 2,000 days, but in order to fully recognise those benefits, we need to be thinking over a much longer time span. Now, I'm not here to speak on behalf of the government, but I would put money on the fact that if either Minister Upston or Minister Willis was standing here, they would then point to the social investment approach as being a mechanism that this government is using to try and partly address those two issues. So some of the key elements of a social investment approach include taking a longer term view across multiple areas of people's lives, supporting investment in early intervention and prevention, and providing holistic support to people and their families and whānau. And the Social Investment Fund that Minister Willis announced the week before budget effectively creates a portfolio neutral approach, which particularly helps address that first challenge where you've got investment in one sector for benefits across others. And if you are, really geeky about these things, you may have looked at the two cabinet papers that were proactively released by the Social Investment Agency. I won't assume that people have, but if you look at those, one of the things that you will see is the priorities, the initial priorities for the Social Investment Fund include the priorities for the Child and Youth Strategy. So we are really excited about that opportunity. We're working now with the Social Investment Agency around that funding that was announced for positive parenting. And we see real opportunities in terms of the implementation of the strategy and picking up on some of the things from Jaimie's research through that process. So I'll stop there because I think I just have 10 minutes, but thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Hannah. That's fascinating. I should mention that when it comes to Q&A, of course, our government officials will not be able to answer politically related questions, but Jaimie will, and our next speaker will as well. Jacqui Southey is Advocacy and Research Director at Save the Children New Zealand.
Koutou ko Jacqui Southey tōku ingoa no wararapraho, and I've already introduced my role, and I'd just like to take a moment to thank Jaimie for this incredible research and reiterate the importance of this research in the New Zealand context. Save the Children globally has long relied or been huge supporters of the first 1,000 days, because we know, we've seen in action the difference that can be made when we invest in the first 1,000 days of a child's life, and then that is really confirmed in that second 1,000 days, and really we're looking at that under 5 space as being critically important, but sadly can be often ignored as we see children being the future and see their future potential coming in at the end when they're getting those, high school certificates and qualifications, and children have a different value, but really we've got to see them for their full value pre-birth right through the life course trajectory. So I'd just like to also point out the importance of the findings for organisations such as ours, where we're seeking to provide important policy advice that will advance children's rights and well-being, and see children and the way we regard children as key stakeholders in the policies and decisions that are made for Aotearoa New Zealand. So in the questions that we were asked to address, is in response to the question about what are the barriers to child-centred policy design and how may we fix them, or the challenges. And Hannah talked about this, and so has Jaimie. There needs to be that holistic approach. So it seems we're all agreed upon that. Intentionally considering how the policy will impact children now, how it will impact their rights, and how it will impact their well-being and their life course well into adulthood. This is also relevant to budget decision-making. Too often it appears that policies are being developed in isolation. For example, policies on housing need to also consider children, health, education, and income adequacy. Policies on education need to consider health, child and whānau support, accessibility, technology, and income adequacy, and that's not a full description of everything that should be considered. Taking the holistic longer view is also critical. We need positives that affect positive outcomes now in the short or immediate term, but we also need to consider what does that longer term trajectory look like, and how will these policies affect that positive change or where we want to go in the longer term. And how we regard children is a critical piece of that. It is critical for effective policies and budget decisions that are for them. If our lens is fixed on the long term only, where children are the future, we can fall into the trap that all will be well in the future, that we'll get there. However, without concrete milestones and a clear plan to achieve the positive future, it runs the risk of becoming the land of never ever sometime in the future. Conversely, if we fixate on the immediate term, policies can be guilty of short-term gain that ends up being long-term pain. And this is certainly an issue for budget decisions. The desire to balance the books, make savings, only do what is critical, can see a failure to effectively invest in that future. This research shows us that there is a clear need and positive opportunity to adequately invest in our youngest children to ensure positive long-term outcomes. Investments that support all children will achieve the most. For example, the Best Start payment was universal for infants up to 12 months, up to 12 months. And then means tested for the subsequent 2 years. It was an investment in every single one of our babies in the first year of their lives. Unfortunately, it will now be means tested from birth and capped at 97,000. Meaning thousands of babies in whānau will miss this critical financial support in the first year of life. This research shows us that it's largely income adequacy that reduces maternal stress and lifts positive child behaviours, and therefore a more positive child development trajectory in the long term. Yet we've just seen the cutting of a policy that lifts the incomes for mothers with infants. So what can we do now that will help children's futures most? Improve household incomes and reduce maternal stress in the preschool years. The evidence is clear. This includes ensuring mothers, their children and families have adequate incomes, stable and affordable, healthy housing that they can call home, regular access to healthy food security, and access to quality healthcare when they need it to feel well and healthy in dealing with the pressures of parenting in those early years. Income adequacy is critical. It directly impacts the standard of living that every single one of us can achieve. Mothers of preschool children have the important work of raising their child. It is not their job alone, as Jaimie pointed out. However, this research looks at mothers, and this primarily at mothers. The first 1,000 days is critical. A child's brain is 80% developed by the time they are 3 years of age. This is crucial in terms of the significant development that is happening during this time. The next 2.5 years or next 1,000 days are critical in continuing that development, that period of physical, social, and emotional development, readying the child for a positive trajectory well into adulthood. Mothers or the primary carer have limitations on their ability to engage in paid work outside of the home, particularly if they're in a sole parent household. We need to provide adequate income support to enable primary carers to do that critical work of raising their child in the early years. It is an investment in ensuring our children live good lives now and have bright futures to look forward to. It also invests in our prosperous future as a nation. And finally, emerging issues for children that I think we may risk missing. Failing to take a holistic approach means piecemeal policy, and policy that is driven by the government of the day. And I'm not talking about this government here, so I don't want that misconstrued. I'm talking about any government of any day. We need to see agreed policy that is cross-party or political commitment so that we can embed policy, positive policy that works for children into the fabric of our lives. Another risk is picking and choosing what we focus on. So as Jaimie pointed out, for example, the relationship between screen use and increased behavioural challenges. This could look like putting all of the onus onto reducing screen time and then expecting child behaviours to be just fixed. Or pressure on mothers to stop the use of screens for their child, inferring that it's the mother's problem. This fails to understand that the drivers of excessive screen use and the intersectionality of other contributing factors that drive up maternal stress, including income, housing, and food insecurity, or poor maternal health. The findings of this research provide incredibly rich and valuable insights into positive changes we can achieve if we make the commitment to act on the findings. Income adequacy, increase housing security, increase food security, increase accessible quality healthcare, reduce maternal stress, and reduce hardship for all. And thank you, that was a great opportunity to share. And I'll pass back to Arthur.
Jacqui, our final panelist today is Jen Russell. Jen's a development paediatrician and also clinical chief advisor at the Ministry of Health. Jen.
Kia ora koutou katoa. Ko Jen Russell tōku ingoa. Jaimie, thank you for inviting me to be part of this amazing panel. It's so nice to be back in the capital where I grew up. That was a really masterful presentation, I think we've seen from Jaimie, in communicating what was quite complicated statistical analysis into something very understandable. And you could see there from Jaimie's diagrams just how complex this phenomena of parenting and children's behaviour is. And I'm standing here today, I wear two hats. One is as a starship paediatrician, and as a clinician, I'm deep in the complexity of people's lives. And I have a caseload of about 200 or more children in whānau, each of whom have quite high needs, and work in, sometimes we're having meetings across agencies just to try and address behavioural challenges in single children. But at the same time, I have this role looking out at the whole population and the needs of the whole population. So I want to just reflect on both of those, using both those lenses. And also tautoko of what Jacqui just shared, that was really necessary and powerful for you to say. So I've changed a little bit what I'm going to say based on what's already been said. The first thing is that my heart rate went up a little bit when Hannah said health has the universal offering. Because we do. Health has the universal offering, but at the same time, our offering is not universally delivered. So health has the Well Child Tamariki Ora program, and there is work underway within Health New Zealand and supported by Ministry of Health to support the team, the Kahutarima team, who are redesigning the Well Child Tamariki Ora program. Some of you might remember the Well Child Tamariki Ora review, which was published 2021-2022, which really documented very concerning inequities in our Well Child Tamariki Ora schedule. And for those who aren't aware, the schedule involves all children in New Zealand being offered free health and developmental screening and input from a trained health professional from birth through to the before school check. It includes vision and hearing and developmental screening. And one of the issues there was Māori and Pacific children really missing out. Really high numbers of children missing their core checks. And we know how important early intervention is. So if we're not picking it up, and also if we expect that because of other upstream determinants, that these populations might even have higher rates of challenging behaviour, then that's compounding the issue. And the other issue that we had found was that the Well Child Tamariki Ora program just didn't seem to be connecting with families as well. Maybe there's a cultural misalignment. But I think it's really important to say that in Aotearoa we have the bones of a very good universal program. And when I'm overseas, I frequently talk to academics and practitioners who know of our program and who wish that they had something similar. So we shouldn't give up on it. We definitely need to strengthen and improve it. I think the key thing I'd say about our Well Child Tamariki Ora system is that we need to offer something that is of value to families. It cannot be a checklist exercise. Families need to come in and leave feeling really supported, like their child and their whānau and their needs are seen and heard, and that we have the levers to address them. The other thing that the really loud message that I think is coming from Jaimie's research is the importance of a universally proportionate approach. Again, going back to this idea that in health we have the universal offering. We need to offer a program to everybody, and we need to layer on top of that additional support and investment for those who need it. And there are some families that have a very high level of need. There are challenges for our program. Firstly is we're in a fiscally constrained environment, so finding the additional investment to put into the redesign and then operationalising the new design of the Child Tamahi Ki Ora program is going to require political prioritisation and leadership. Secondly, our workforces. Our workforces are stretched. One of the key changes in the redesign is to introduce use of the ages and stages questionnaire, replacing the PEDS, which the PEDS is a 10-item checklist which asks parents whether they themselves have any concerns for their children's development. It's quite subjective, and there is a phenomenon whereby more highly educated parents perceive greater level of difficulties in their children. And in my own research with growing up in New Zealand, I found that in our highest deprivation neighbourhoods, very high proportions of children were lagging behind in their development, something like up to about 1 in 4 children. And one of my colleagues around 2020 went into a neighbourhood in Auckland and performed standardised developmental assessments on every child in 3 ECEs, and could only find a single child in one of the ECEs whose developmental score fell in the typical range, so within 1 standard deviation of the mean. There are pockets of children, pockets in neighbourhoods where children's development is lagging, and the families may not perceive it. So shifting to the ages and stages questionnaire is a really fantastic step, came out of the World Child Tamahi Ki Ora review, which will help us detect with a much more objectivity and precision children's developmental difficulties, and also, if there's additional investment, has potential to produce geographic data on children's development, which enables us to get a microdata view. And if we manage to achieve that, we would be doing better than other health systems which have incredible microdata on children's development, such as Australia and Canada and Ireland. We would have built something really remarkable. But all of that is going to require additional investment. So as I say that as a public health servant, but also as a frustrated clinician. We need to collaborate with education, because education holds early intervention. And we need to collaborate with the early education sector, much of which is privatised, so that they are also, all these workforces are skilled in the detection and identification and support of children with developmental needs. And from my conversations with the early education sector, they're very keen for this approach. To give you a sense of just how many children have developmental needs, in my own research with growing up, I found it was about 1 in 4 are lagging behind in any developmental domain, that's in any. Many of those children will come right in time. But if you look at international literature, about 5 to 8% of preschoolers will have a language delay or difference or difficulty in their preschool years, many of which will come right. But for those children in the preschool years, how are they to communicate if they don't have the language? And when I worked in psychiatry, a psychiatrist, an adult psychiatrist once said to me, that is, the psychiatrist treating adults, not an adult, we're all adults, all psychiatrists are adults. This psychiatrist said to me, and I've never forgotten it because it's been the most helpful thing anyone's ever said to me in pediatrics, behaviour is a form of communication. A child who can't hear because they have had glue ear and haven't had their ears checked because it's been difficult to get to a doctor, or they're on a wait list for a specialist. A child who can't hear can't develop language. A child who's not spoken to and nurtured because the family is very stressed cannot develop language in the same way. And a child who's not read to will not develop language in the same way as a child who's read to frequently. So this is coming out in Jaimie's research. Language is really integral to children's communication. And if a child doesn't have language, they will communicate in whatever means they can. And that will be through behaviour. So dovetailing with Jaimie's research, there is a wealth of evidence from international studies showing that poverty is highly correlated with children's language skills. Just one study I'll highlight by Justice et al., 2019, published in Maternal and Child Health Journal. It's quite a highly referenced study. Found that 2-year-old children in the United States growing up in poverty had spoken language skills, expressive language skills, vocabulary, that was on average 1 standard deviation below the mean, population mean. And that is exactly what my colleague who went into ECEs and tested all the children was finding. There are also very steep socioeconomic gradients in children's language development in the preschool years. But the good news is that language development is very sensitive to the to and fro interactions that nurture and care, the serve and return that, you know, Harvard Center for the Developing Child talks about. Language is very sensitive to that. And in some ways, poverty itself is the upstream determinant of those interactions, those sensitive, caring, nurturing interactions between parents and their children that develops language. So you'd like to think that it's not all on fixing poverty alone. We can improve and lift children's communication skills. And as we lift their communication skills, we are also developing better brains. Because underlying this relationship that Jaimie's highlighted between poverty and behaviour is also, and language, if I put language in there, this is underpinned by brain development, which itself is heavily shaped by experience of poverty. And in fact, for children in the most severe poverty, if you just incrementally lift their incomes even a little bit, studies have shown that there are demonstrable differences in functional brain scanning and changes in their grey matter in regions of the brain which are associated with executive function, language development, and emotion regulation. So proportionate universalism, but also targeting the income, the most highest needs families, will help the brains of our children. The last challenge I want to speak to is just how difficult it is to intervene in a parenting system. Families are systems. And when I sit with families, it takes me a long time sitting with them and talking to them to understand what is happening around the child that is influencing the child's behaviour. So when we're thinking about interventions such as parenting programs that might be able to meet the needs of families, I think it's really important that we have flexible programs that are able to flex up, flex down. Some families need a little and some families need a lot. We need programs that are able to parent children with additional needs, chronic health conditions, disability, and who are neurodiverse, because there's a very large proportion of children who would fit that bill. Consider something between, you know, again, sort of 5 to 7% of children will be presenting with ADHD in the early years. And we need flexible duration for programs, short-lived through to intensive. And in this room, I'm sure that people have had experience or oversight of, or even lead parenting interventions and programs in the home, which are all represented here. But the useful one that we have found at Starship is Lead Bernardo's, just for its flexibility. In-home offerings, short-lived to intensive, cultural fit, able to handle almost every kind of condition. Social worker first approach. So the last thing I want to say is that poverty itself needs to be addressed. Sometimes when I'm working with a family, I'm just going to read what I've written here, it can feel a bit like trying to cook a meal with the leftovers in the pantry. I've got a bit of cheese, some pasta, and a single carrot in the fridge. When we have a multi-agency professional meeting, we're trying to cobble together for a family a bit of support from Variety and a bit of support from WINS and a bit of support from Disability Support Services and so on. It can feel like we're there and our job is to try and cobble together a meal for the family. And this, for the family, takes a lot of mental energy applying for various funding streams and enforces a sense of precarity. What children really need to flourish, what they really, really need, is love and nurture, but provide, and stability, but provide in a really consistent, predictable way. Children need rhythms and routines in their home. They need consistency in their home. Of course, children can handle, brains can handle, and be flexible around a variety of changes and transitions. We would expect that. But for children to really flourish and thrive and do well with their learning and their development, we need those rhythms and routines and the consistency of nurturing care. And if we can provide that consistency in our policy settings for families, so that families can rely upon this and have confidence, I think we'll get the best for our children. Kia ora.
Thank you very much, Jen. Try and invite Jaimie and the three panelists to come and sit up here. Now's your chance to, anything you want to know about parenting, where you went wrong, you can
Ask
start.
Arthur.
And I'm going to start right at the back, Philippa Howden Chapman. If you can introduce yourself, because I don't know everyone, and then we'll take one from the screen.
Thank you very much. That was a wonderful session, I must say, and I agree with the whole perspective of it. I'm obsessed with housing, of course, although I was originally a clinical psychologist and worked at the Manatū Psychopedic Hospital with children who were slowly learning, and in those days they were institutionalised, and it was teaching parents how to catch them being good and reinforce their behaviour. Nevertheless, I've decided great social investment from 30 years of work in this has to be public and community housing. And there's increasing support also from American literature that mothers who have got stable quality house affordable, and of course if you've got community or public housing, you only pay 25% of your household income. They had lower rate of premature babies, lower rates of neonatal problems, and lower rates of maternal mortality. And I think I haven't seen an analysis done that in New Zealand, but when I was looking at midwifery earlier on in hospitals, we certainly still got a lot of those problems. So I think if we're crystallising an issue, it has to be stable, secure, affordable housing. And we've just finished some work on emergency housing and looking what the impact of children there is. Terrible, because it's all the things that you talked about, Jaimie. So thank you.
Any comments on that, on the panel?
I do. I mean, housing is so central in New Zealand, and I think it's an income problem because we see when you're spending 40–50% of your income on housing, there is nothing left over for food. There's nothing left over for all these things. I also like to think of agency of housing as well, in terms of these opportunities that families need to be able to move for, whether that's a job, a school, whether that's to be close to grandparents. We need to make sure that families have that agency of housing as well.
Yeah, I'd just like to add that housing is critical. It's a cornerstone of childhood. It supports children to live in communities, to feel loved and nurtured, and it has a wraparound support for their whānau as well. So you've got friends down the street, you've got a regular school that you can go to, and you're not feeling so precarious in life. And unfortunately, we're seeing budget decision makings around housing as it being a cost to New Zealand, a cost to taxpayers. We actually need to change that framing and see it as an investment, taxpayer investment, and stable communities, a prosperous future for New Zealand. And I really encourage, that we all talk about housing in that way, that we see it as it's a need. It's not just simply a cost to government, it's an investment.
Let's move on to another question. Emma from the Zoom.
How do we persuade a government ideologically opposed to social housing and with punitive approaches to poverty to work, invest upstream for whānau and not just target a growing group of kids with social programs, usually too late?
I probably won't ask the government people to comment on that. I'll ask the same too, and we're working unless you really want to risk your jobs. Jane, I'll let you comment.
Well, I think you've always got evidence and you've got the political context in which you have to try and match those two things up. I think this is forever a problem that's always tricky for researchers and academics as well. I think the kind of work I do, I'm lucky in that you can apply something like a social investment approach to it. And so if you're using evidence, then you have to understand that context first. So yes, I guess understand what drives the decision makers and then try and find the evidence that frames it in the right way. I guess it's other than that, framing is important. Yeah.
Why don't we move to another question? Right at the back there. You can speak as loudly as you can, please.
You mentioned about household with high income who have children with better social behavior. What I'm thinking of, both the father and mother are working. So during the day, the child is left in childcare. Does it mean that the environment that the child is exposed to improve his or her social behavior, be more friendly, more approachable, more effective in communication? That's my opinion.
Yes, and I think childcare is a big part of this picture, and one that I haven't actually gone into in this analysis for a bunch of statistical reasons, which I won't go into. I think these high-income families, there's probably I don't necessarily imagine that if they're in care for hours, 40 hours a week. My suspicion is it's actually more the middle income families that are having those high levels of care because they just require that much income in order to be able to pay for their housing. Those higher income families, there's more ability to purchase things like a subscription meal plan, a cleaner, all these things that allow parents when they are at home with their kids to be able to engage with them. So yeah.
Any other thoughts, Hannah?
Yes, so there's some really good evidence that shows that low-income families are the ones who have the most to gain from engagement in quality early childcare. So getting that balance, because of course affordability is a challenge lower down the income stream. So getting the balance in terms of the way in which ECE is funded between additional financial support at the lower end of the income spectrum, but also ensuring that early childcare that serves lower income families is particularly high quality is actually a real opportunity.
Jen, you mentioned stuff about ECE as well in your talk. Do you have a thought of that?
I mean, I was actually, Hannah said everything that I was going to say, that it's the quality of ECE that's really important.
Can I just back that up? I have another PhD student who's just finished his PhD working on the role of the effect of ECE on outcomes for children, and the benefits that are seen in most countries are not really seen in New Zealand, and in particular for low income. And one of the things in New Zealand is that we have these huge barns. People of 100 kids go to the same ECE, or 200 kids, or 300 kids in some instances, where the staff don't even know the kids. So it's not surprising that the quality of ECE in New Zealand is so poor that we don't actually see the same benefits for the poor kids. The rich parents, of course, can send their kids to a nice 20 or 30 kid ECE around the corner. You get a much better quality design. So I think this is a really interesting area for future research, to be honest. Don't rely on the international evidence, rely on the New Zealand evidence. So,
yeah, I can also just add to that important point, Arthur, and that's about, it's more than care, it's about education. It's early childhood care and education. And there is research that we've completed, but global research that shows that it's a shared care model when children are in early childhood care. As a parent, you're sharing the care of your child with your early childhood teachers. And when it's really strong and really positive, they can provide positive influence to parents. And in fact, early childhood teachers are the most trusted and regularly used professional support for parents in New Zealand. So I think it's something that we need to keep investing in: accessible, affordable, quality early childhood education for all children.
Emma, do you have another question from Zoom?
As an early intervention provider in child development service, I see a huge need for more providers, funding and education to meet the needs of our at-risk tamariki. However, we're not training enough providers to meet this need. Occupational therapists, physical therapists, social workers, speech and language therapists, psychologists. And our new grads are majority Pakeha women. How can our system support at-risk tamariki and their families feeling like they can relate to their providers? It seems so much wider than just child development. It is the structure of our higher education and health system.
Any thoughts on that from maybe Jen or Hannah?
I think in budget 2025, there is a budget line in there around early intervention, and the provision of speech language therapists is in there. And I don't have the precise figures off the top of my head. I thought it was something like, I'm conscious I'm online, so probably someone's Googling and fact checking me now, but fact check me live, please. I think it's something like almost 80 speech language therapy FTE. Wow. Two things to say around that. One is, yes, we need more therapists, but based on the prevalence data that we would expect in terms of the behaviour needs and the developmental needs for children, I can firmly say that health can't meet this alone. Early intervention providers can't meet this alone. We have to have resources and offerings that allow parents to be first teachers, and also that allow our ECE kāko to be part of the solution. We actually have to collaborate because there's just such numbers of children who have needs.
Okay, Liam, I think you were. So, hang on, I had one in front. Liam, did you have your hand up before or not?
Yeah.
You did, okay, yeah.
Just a wee question to Jaimie, in terms of that you're very thoughtful and provocative modelling. There's one thing we know about growing up in New Zealand. It's the only really good statistical survey we have where each of the Maori, Pacific and European populations are represented equally well.
Yeah.
I wonder, given the huge differences that we know in your key variables of income, family structure, family form, that if you had a look at analysing each of those three populations separately with your model, and that to address the sort of issues that Jen raised, because you've got enough sample size in each of those individual populations.
Yeah, there's a reason I haven't brought ethnicity up in this, and that was actually intentional. I have done a lot of work on the ethnicity data. We've got there's a lot more attrition in those particular samples. And I think with ethnicity data, there's also other work that calls a little bit of question on this cultural validity of the SDQ, the Strengths and Difficulties questionnaire, particularly for Pacific families. And so I didn't want to jump up and down about ethnicity without a solid ground, without the statistical backing behind that. So in the paper there's more work on it if you want to have a look in greater detail. But yes, that's one of the strengths of it. They are all in the sample. I just haven't broken them down because I don't think by saying that this particular ethnic group has this happening, am I saying anything of substance? We have to be careful.
Right. But however you address it, you are addressing it implicitly.
Yes, we know who's everyone knows who's most represented in these groups. That's not a surprise. And I don't think it's necessarily because of their ethnicity and the way it's been labelled. Yeah.
Can you please explain how the work of the child and youth strategy intersects with Te Aroere Kura, given that the majority of child sexual abuse occurs under the age of 12 years and there are high rates of inter-sibling harm? Can Jaimie comment on the role trauma effects have played in her research, particularly for parents?
Let's do the first part first. Hannah, do you know about that?
Yes, so we worked really closely with Te Puna Anui when we were looking at the priorities for the strategy. There was a real desire to make sure that there were distinct roles here. There weren't lots of people all trying to do the same thing and just making a really messy space. So Te Aroere Kura version 2.0 is more focused at the response end. So they have a priority around children. It's not one of those immediate priority areas of focus, but it is one of the, I think, 8 priorities in Te Aroere Kura. But the things that Te Aroere Kura is focusing on is more about responding once harm has occurred, preventing further harm occurring, whereas the strategy is more primary prevention. So what are the things that we need to do to de-risk those situations, to build the protective factors that stops harm occurring in the first place? So that's certainly at a conceptual level, that's how those two things sit alongside each other.
Okay, thanks. And the side, there's any role of trauma in your work, Jaimie?
Obviously, families in the lower income groups are more likely to have experienced that, and so that's why when we do the kind of modelling that looks at within family changes, that's able to take that into account in ways that when you compare groups, it's not. So I'll leave it at that.
Jonathan, can I come to you?
So, a fabulous presentation, thank you, and thank you for the great work you've been doing, Jaimie. I have a puzzle and then a broader question, perhaps. The puzzle was just relating to your very first diagram, in which you have a box at the top saying that these are the main factors influencing things, namely, well, among them, stress, parental, maternal stress in this case. And then off to the right, you had the factors that weren't relevant, one of which was people moving house. And yet when you came to a subsequent diagram, you had the stress being significantly influenced by people moving house, which makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So I was just puzzled as to why that was. And then just putting that in the context of particularly Philippa's comments and indeed other comments that people have made. If part of the challenge we have in New Zealand is very much in the housing arena and is in the fact that we have very little social housing by international standards, 4% of total housing stock compared with 20% or more in some European jurisdictions. And if we have a context in which there is so little security of tenure for people in private rental accommodation, which I suspect would be a dominant form of housing for most of the low-income people in your sample in the Growing Up in New Zealand study. Then the question is, okay, first, to what extent do we have good international evidence of much lower stress levels, for example, in some of the European jurisdictions? But then secondly, since we can't dramatically increase the social housing stock overnight, what can we do to improve security of tenure for people in private rentals?
Jaimie, do you want to start here and then we'll give some other responses?
Yep, the statistical conundrum is to do with the fact we're looking purely, the second one was to do with just mothers. The first one was parents and children. And so it seems to be that the stress, this new project I'm doing looks in depth at housing. And so I'll give you some more in-depth answers to all the dynamics that are happening there. Parents can seem to protect their children a little bit from the stress of moving. So if they're finding it stressful, they might not be passing that stress on to their children. How we can protect? I think there's some clear rules that you can start to provide legislatively around security of tenure and not being able to kick tenants out for no reason. I think that's important. We can't magically build public housing in a hurry. And so security of tenure, and I think the other aspect for children is related to KiwiSaver and long-term wealth distributions that are happening due to housing ownership. There's intergenerational benefits, and unless we have something to compensate for the families that are not getting that, like a decent retirement savings plan, then we're also going to have long-term problems for children in that space too. Is that enough?
Anybody else want to add anything on that? No? Emma, one question and then we'll come back.
There are a couple of people asking if any of the data covers LGBTQ families, and specifically if the data on mothers is defined as parents, birthing parents, or does it include families with, say, 2 mums?
It does, in that they are in the sample in very small numbers. Not enough for me to be able to pull them out and say anything relevant, or to breach the data rules around not sharing small numbers of people. So yes, those families are in there. They're not identifiable enough to me to get in and to be able to say anything of substance. Yeah.
We have another question. We have two here. Go to the one in the back and then I'll come to you. Okay? Yeah, the one in the front here.
Alex Ferguson, Stats NZ. I really appreciated that presentation. I thought it was really interesting. And in particular, I was wondering, you talked a little bit about sort of using the longitudinal nature of the study. And I was wondering for the 8-year-olds in particular, how much weight, when you were looking at the behavioural differences, was placed on current state of affairs versus the impacts from that you'd been observing back when they were 2, for instance. So say household income when they're an 8-year-old versus household income back when they were 2.
Yeah, this is all to do with the modelling approach you use and the way the new project I'm doing looks at trajectories, and so it's able to get in a little bit more on that. So this one, you have to see the snapshots and see it over time. It's a little bit hard. I haven't isolated that difference in this work. Yeah,
I'll add something there. I mean, if you just look at the broader international research literature, it's a very nice study done by the Murdoch Children's Research Institute by Meredith O'Connor. I think it was published 2017 in Pediatrics. It showed that, and they used 2 longitudinal databases to do this study. So they've adjusted for cohort effects as well. But what they found was that if a child's family falls into poverty during infancy and then recovers, even the fall into poverty is associated with poor learning outcomes at age 8. And I think you can make some inferences there based on that. And that would not be the only study that would have shown a specific effect for the first 2,000 days.
Thanks, Jan, that's very interesting. Emma, any more from online? We've got some more from the floor.
Yeah.
Tell you what, I'll go for one from the floor and then we'll come back to it. So, yeah.
That was actually the first part of the question I was going to ask. That's like. Great, yeah, wonderful presentation and really interesting data being pulled out here. I noticed, yeah, the pregnancy to 8 years old was sort of the width of the data, I guess, and the age of the child. And I'm kind of wondering if you could extrapolate outside that support, but it seemed to be that some of the relationships between income and child difficulties were stronger when they were younger and then weakened as they got into that 8-year band. Do you have any evidence to suggest, or can you make a prediction about what happens as they go at 12 years or 16 years about that income to difficulty relationship?
I'm not sure. I think it's going to be, again, you have to take this developmental approach to it. In the early years, what's important is the parent-child, these kind of interactions. As they get older, the world opens up. And so quality of schooling, these sorts of things make a difference. Communities, neighbourhoods, peer relationships become supremely important during adolescence. And so how income affects that, I'm not entirely sure. It's probably context dependent on the child. My suspicion is that you wouldn't see as strong effects as you do in the preschool years. But data has been known to surprise me, so.
It'd be interesting to see this, I guess, in 4 years' time, if it's just like waiting for the children to grow up, sort of thing. I guess.
Wait till we pass adolescence.
I was just going to say, I was actually involved in a discussion yesterday with Growing Up in New Zealand team because they are planning the Now We Are 17 data collection wave. They're currently working on the reports from Now We Are 15, but one of the things, so that the process goes that they have a policy forum where they invite policymakers, I don't think just from government, but people who might be interested in using the research to help shape some of those questions. And that question about to what extent do we keep, seeing the impact of things that happen in the early years, how does the influence of different variables change, is one of the things that we are really keen to continue to explore, because that's the huge value of longitudinal data to actually, or one of the huge values of longitudinal data is to be able to explore what that looks like over a longer trajectory.
I think you get more psychosocial pathways playing a role there, and how young people perceive themselves and their status and their capability in relationship to family income. And that came out in Youth Health Survey data, actually. There's an interesting study, and I don't know the author, but it was performed in India some time ago, where they asked children to perform a maths test twice. And before they performed the maths test the second time, they stood up and gave the occupation of their father, and then sat down and sat the test. Wow. And that study showed that for the children with, lower position parents, that there was an impact on their test scores relative to themselves. And I think what that study was attempting to show was the psychosocial pathway, because a lot of what Jaimie's picking up on here is the study will show in the early years, there'll be the family dynamic and there'll be the material resources available to family. Nutrition, access to GPs and primary care, access to books, this sort of thing, access to stimulating resources and so on. But as young people get older, you get this effect where they become very aware of their own poverty. And that has its own cycle. So it'd be good to tease that out growing up.
Fascinating. We've got a couple more questions, and I've got Phil, and there's another one from here as well. I'm going to get you to ask them both at the same time. Phil, slightly staggered. Can you ask yours, Emma, then I'll ask Phil, and then I'll get comments on both.
As a follow-up to Jim's discussion about unidentified needs within the first year primary school age children, do you have any data identifying what proportion of children with behavioural difficulties have their difficulties first identified within the first 2,000 days versus once they are within the primary school system? E.g., to what extent are we reliant on our primary school system and teachers to identify those needs?
And Phil, what's your questions that are interesting and related?
Firstly, Jaimie, thank you very much for the presentation. a questionnaire, like growing up in New Zealand, is only as good as the questions it asks. And that's true of all surveys. So this is a question for the panel, really, all of whom are familiar with growing up in New Zealand. Are there any questions that you would have liked to have seen in that questionnaire that were not there?
Okay, can I get you to answer either or both of those questions? Jen?
I did my PhD with growing up, and so I had access to, you know, the meetings and the processes where it was discussed, and I can tell you that it is extremely difficult to find the balance and to prioritise. And I did some time with the Millennium Cohort study in the UK as well, as they prepared for their adolescent data collection waves, and it was the same. Yeah,
Is there
so
a burning question that you'd like in there that's not in there?
Oh, obviously, but I'm not going to say them all
Okay.
now.
Hannah, either of those 2 points?
So in terms of the online question, I think we do have data about the number of referrals that are made from before school checks that are followed up. But that, you know, there's the referrals, but then it's the follow-ups that are captured. What I don't know is the extent to which anybody has looked at what that looks like in terms of a proportion of the number of children who are.
Yeah, I think my perception is, and I'd need to trawl through data to figure this out, my perception is that there are population groups who are not accessing diagnoses, for instance, for ADHD until later. So there's a delay in diagnosis and potentially would have been beneficial for them to get the diagnosis earlier. But I think we have data from before school check, but we don't actually have good data showing when children are being picked up more generally within systems with behaviour dysregulation or emotional dysregulation, because parents will identify it for themselves and then they'll go and seek help. And that might be through primary care, or they might do a parenting program themselves, or they might put some intervention in place.
Thanks for that. Jacqui, did you have a thought on this?
Well, I guess it's similar to what something Jaimie touched on earlier in her presentation was about, we know that supports for parents are good and that they're effective, but making them easily accessible. So understanding from parents themselves what are the barriers. So for example, positive parenting we know is incredibly important, and so it's easy to say, well, let's do courses. Let's get everyone doing a class. But then we also know from other research that parents don't take on classes unless primarily they're told to go take a class. So how do we make that accessible, that support accessible? What do parents themselves want to see? And how has that changed over time? Because another thing, people say, oh, we'll just put it online. But there's so much online. How do you know what's
Often it's the phone, being able to talk with other parents that's really helpful.
Jaimie, do you want to have a final say on this, either of these questions?
I would say with the growing up in New Zealand, I want to know, does families' income meet needs? I really love that question because it captures so much consistently over time, and I want them to ask about these difficulties questions over time in exactly the same way, so I can track them as well. Anything longer term is perfect.
Yeah, that sounds like a very good piece of advice to anybody running longitudinal survey. Consistency, please.
Consistency, please.
Okay, look, can I thank our 3 panelists who joined Jaimie, so Jen, Hannah and Jacqui, and a special thanks to Jaimie for a fabulous presentation. Fascinating. Thanks again to Russ McVeigh and to Ecostats NZ and Treasury for supporting the series.
Thanks, Arthur.
Looking forward to our hobby.
Yeah, me too.
Really good.
Yeah. I haven't seen you in ages. I just mentioning you in a society meeting the other day. I was in, what's yeah, me too.